Good morning to our audience in North America. Good afternoon to those in Europe and Iraq. My name is David Mack. I was a U.S. diplomat in Iraq when dates and licorice root were still major, or at least significant Iraqi exports. Fortunately, the three panelists today have much more relevant and recent experience with the Iraqi economy and government. Uh, Politics can be defined in various ways, but the classic definition um, by Harold Lasswell in, in 1936 was who gets what, when, and how. That sounds an awful lot like budgeting. And uh, it makes the formation of a national budget a key reflection of a country's political life. Bringing us together is a paper by Ahmed Tabakjali, which has proposed a profound reform in the way the Iraqi government budgets. If one of Iraq's major problems is the way Iraqi politicians go about formulating their national budget, perhaps reform of the budget process can help alleviate Iraq's political problems, systemic political problems, as well as its deep economic crisis. Ahmed's paper is now on the Atlantic Council website. I urge everyone to download it, take a look at it after our program, if you haven't done so already. We will have a chance, I think, after we hear our panelists, we'll have a chance for questions from the audience. If you use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen, I think on most receivers, you'll be able to pose your question. We'll try to get to as many as we can, but I will start by introducing all three of our panelists very, very briefly, since I think all of them are known to most people in the audience. Ahmed, for over 3 decades, Ahmed Tabakjali has analyzed capital markets for a number of banks and investment managers. He applies the tools of economics and mathematical analysis to his real-world experience with Iraq. Commenting on Ahmed's paper and offering their own views on the general subject are two experts who have a long experience in government, private business, and think tanks. Olin Wethington is the founder and chairman of Wethington International, a business advisory firm focused on emerging markets. He's also a board member of the Atlantic Council, is a former U.S. Assistant Secretary of Treasury for International Affairs. He's got a global perspective. I mean, Olin could be speaking on China or Latin America, so we're very grateful that he's helping us focus and taking a hard look at Iraq. Alia Mubayid is the managing director of fixed income strategy at Jefferies International in London. She's an experienced public policy practitioner. In addition to the private sector, Alia has experience with international financial institutions and government where she's participated. And along with being a super smart economist, she has a firsthand knowledge of the countries of the Middle East and North Africa. And following the brief presentations by the panelists, we will pose questions to them from the audience. So use that Q&A function to put your question in queue. Do not use the chat function for this purpose. Now, Ahmed, the virtual podium here is yours. Go ahead.
Well, thank you very much, David, and thank you to the Atlantic Council, and thank you for the Atlantic Council for publishing the paper and for hosting this webinar. I'm extremely grateful for that, and also I am thrilled that I have both Adia and Olin sort of taking part in this, and hopefully they will grill the piece and give me some interesting or hard questions. Now, the whole process really goes is looking at Iraq's budget. As you mentioned earlier, budgets are a crucial aspect of the country, and especially in a country like Iraq, in which the state plays an oversized role in the economy. So therefore, its budget is crucial. And also being almost the source that you can divide the country's, sort of the projects and the country's wealth and so forth, its process is actually quite vital in the sense of allocating resources and also making sure the country goes ahead. Now, the overriding theme that I would like people to have a look at when they look at the paper is not so much as the numbers or the charts themselves, but as the fact that we still pretty much use a 19th century type budget process, i.e. we still use paper and pen based in a very complex economy like Iraq's. I mean, not so much Iraq is complex, but in a very complex world, and especially right now, where we have the financial crisis, the budget process is so essential. And now I'm sure all of you, or many of you who had spent time, at least I know Ali and me did, on looking at the proposed budget. Looking at that, given the fact that Iraq has the current financial crisis, you would think that the budget process is vital. And I think, if anything, my paper has a very relevant on that process, in the sense that it's still the same paper and pen process trying to manage Iraq through its most difficult crisis. And the managers of the paper, or the managers of the reform in Iraq, face the difficulty of working with these tools, which hinder that process. But how did, in a way, this paper start? And I think I would like you to draw your attention to a few elements of it. What started in me was the 2019 budget, because that was the first budget after the ISIS crisis, in which we've just recovered from the disasters of loss of oil revenues, as well as the trauma that the country faced following the war, and the fact that during those times when expenses shot through the roof and yet income collapsed. So in a way, I was looking, and that's when we started the standby agreement with the IMF. So I was hoping that by then, the substantial surplus, or at least the cash surplus that was reported by the Ministry of Finance over 2018, would serve as a sort of source of funding the recovery of Iraq. Because by then anybody who's been in Iraq would have gone through the 2018 conference in Kuwait that explained that Iraq needs $88 billion to fix the damage that ISIS has done. So the 2019 budget was, for me, an essential piece. And yet when I saw it, two things struck me, and that started the whole process I have right now. The first was what we say in Arabic, حليمة رجعت القديمة, which means basically she's gone back to her old tricks. And that's basically the idea, favoring the current expenditures at the expense of investment expenditures. That's the same, the first year in which we were sitting on substantial, well, at the time for us, compared to 2014, 2015, 16, 17, a substantial surplus. And yet all the attention was on the current spending, and very little of it was on investment expenditures. But that was not enough by itself, because one of the things that surprised me was the budget had a projected deficit of around, the paper will have direct, absolutely clear figures, but I'm speaking in round figures. It had something like 27 and something trillion dinars in projected deficit. And yet the funding of that deficit did not feature many elements of the same surplus that we talked about. On the one hand, one part of me was grateful, was thinking, well, they don't know about it, so therefore they will not waste that money. But that was one element. The other was, why? We were sitting on 25 trillion dinars in a surplus, and yet we projected a deficit of 27, and we were looking to funding it from multiple sources, including what we use, or what to me it seems the system uses as a proxy for a surplus, and that is the carried over funds in the Ministry of Finance. The figure they had was something like 7.8 trillion dinars. And yet, the same figures that you use, the Ministry of Finance has its accounts with the Central Bank of Iraq. And yet the same Central Bank of Iraq data was showing that, in fact, the surplus funds started at something, ended the year at something like 20 trillion dinars. So that started me going into why. Why is that? Not so much as looking as there is foul play, but mostly it's a function of a paper-based system. And it has extreme issues for us going forward. And I don't want to use all the time I have, but basically what has started me going, I know, for example, the data that I use, there could always be question marks on it, because basically it's the same paper-based system that is reporting the budget execution figures. So that's obviously one challenge. The other challenge is the account surpluses that of the Ministry of Finance and others are. The Ministry of Finance is sent by the CBI, which is actually fairly accurate, but then you're looking at the banks. The state has all its funds with two banks, basically mostly two banks, as well as the TBI. So you have Rafidin or Rashid. I know they're fairly using even more ancient systems. They don't have a core banking system. So their reporting is not fully accurate. You know, there's always going to be data lag. There's always going to be elements of duplication and so forth. So I wanted to, basic words that came back in, how do I test my idea of where does this surplus go? So I started an exercise in which I looked at the accumulated surplus. So I started adding the monthly surpluses as reported Ministry of Finance. And then I thought, okay, since I don't know what exactly goes into these bank accounts, but at least I can look at account balances as of month end. So I said, okay, let's look at the accumulated surpluses. And that's a chart that you have in the paper, which clearly in my mind shows, okay, they don't have to be accurate because you're talking different sources. There's data integrity issues and data accuracy, but the trends should match. And the trends really matched, i.e. the surplus that the government was reporting showed itself into an increased accumulated surplus. So I'm talking about only the increases and decreases to the funds as of 2017. So the increases and decreases pretty much matched in overall shape the budget. And that's what started the whole process. It started one paper that I published about a few months ago with the London School of Economics, which was the accounts that didn't bark. And that's basically, again, does the government know all its bank balances? And it doesn't, because we don't have what's called the Treasury single account. Part of the whole process is, do we have a public financial management system? And the answer, no, we don't have. And the consequences of that, we don't have a Treasury single account, and we don't have what's called an integrated financial management system, which basically is a long phrase to describe a system that actually links all ministries. So in theory, at the touch of a button, the government or the Ministry of Finance would know where it's spending and where everything is going. We don't have that. So we end up having to rely on paper-based system. That paper-based system creates not only significant anomalies, but also creates a lot of no data. So the ultimate result is the various ministries and various government entities, they all pretty much stand alone as their own separate fiefdoms, which pretty much ties in with the theory that the political system we have, in which by every ministry is taken over by whoever party controls it at that time. And to me, the financial element of that was, yes, this whole paper-based system is a feature of the system and not a bug, because that perpetuates the complete autonomy that everyone has. And that leads us to where we are today. How can the reform take place when, one, the finance ministry has no control over the finances of the government, and secondly, how do we get moving from here? The white paper acknowledges this as a major shortfall and tries to accelerate the process of introducing an IFMIS as well as TSA, which has been ongoing, by the way, since 2004. But with this, let me end that. I mean, if there is time, I can go over two crucial things in the new budget that features that, but I'll leave that maybe to a bit later. So I think I've used my 5-10 minutes.
Okay, thank you very much, Ahmed, and I appreciate you providing us with such a concise look at not only at your paper, but by the incentives that moved you to do the hard work and scholarship that went into the paper. So that's much appreciated. Um, and I think we can move on now to our next panelist, Olin Wethington. Olington, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mack, and I'm very pleased to be part of this discussion today. And let me begin by congratulating Dr. Tabakjali for the very fine paper that he's produced. I certainly encourage, as Ambassador Mack did, everybody to download it and take a look at it. It certainly is a critical component of any, I think, of any economic reform strategy in Iraq. This is a central component, the necessity for having a state-of-the-art public and integrated public finance management and information system. I would like also at the outset, if I might, to convey my high respect for the very fine work at the Atlantic Council that Dr. Abbas Khadim has underway. He's been the leader behind the Iraq Initiative and an effort to bring to the forefront of policy discussion on Iraq, of fundamentals of governance, of fundamental economic reform. And he's simply doing a marvelous job and has plowed new ground, I think, in this area over the past year or two. I'd like to use the paper that Dr. Tabakjali has prepared for a couple of comments, if I might, on the international dimension of Iraq's economic reform strategy. And I say that, I reference the international dimension of it, recognizing that fundamentally economic reform, putting in place the foundations of a prosperous Iraq, lie with the Iraqi people. And my comments take nothing away from that. We must respect that process. We must respect the independence, the sovereign nature of their decision making. And I say that also with an awareness of the very deep political divisions and dysfunction in many aspects that exists in Iraq. This is compounded by the current very dire economic circumstances that this year they find themselves in. From both a historic perspective and also by way of peer comparisons. They are setting new records, new lows on economic growth, on the size of the budget deficit. The challenges are certainly very, very great, and I want to underscore that. I'd like also to underscore from my perspective that in the midst of these very large challenges, I think we must recognize the seriousness of the approach that the current government has taken on the economic agenda, the issuance of their recent white paper, as well as the recent budget, which seeks to integrate in a comprehensive, cohesive way both an approach to the short-term economic crisis that they find themselves in, to integrate that and balance it with the long-term and medium-term and long-term structural reforms that are necessary. This is a very great challenge. There is opposition to many components of what has been put forward. But I want to come, if I could, Ambassador Mack, just for a few moments to this question of, is there a role for an international component that is supportive of this reform agenda particularly that the Prime Minister and the Finance Minister, also Deputy Prime Minister Ali Alawi, have been pursuing over the last 6 months. And I pose that because I think there is, in a broad sense, an alignment between the substance of what the current government in Iraq has put forward by way of economic reform and what I would characterize as the international financial community. If one was to look at the recent statements, the Article 4 consultation, information on that has become public, the work that the World Bank has done, one will see from a general policy perspective, I think, a large measure of consistency. I'm not talking complete alignment, but there is an appreciation, I think, on the part of the international financial community as to what the current government is seeking to do. Implementation, the politics of this are the real issue. And I think it's at that level of recognition that the question of an international component comes into place. And I think there is room here for a more engaged, a more active engagement on the part of advanced economies, the governments of advanced economies, and the international financial institutions and processes that they are linked with in a very deep way. There is room now, I think it is timely, for an emergence of a more robust engagement by the international financial community, respectful of Iraq's decision-making and their own sovereign prerogatives. I would place this in several categories, if I might. One is what I would call, for lack of a better term, structured consultation. There is structured consultation underway that is seeking expert opinion, seeking reaction, providing sounding boards, seeking commentary on policy. Ideas matter. Thinking matters. Statecraft engagement matter. I think in the context still of Iraq's domestic politics. We see this kind of process, and I'm not talking at this point about financial support necessarily, but I'm talking about an engagement of ideas that is supportive of an economic reform process. We see the beginnings of this in the October meeting that was held in London. It's been referred to as the Iraq Economic Contact Group, which brought together elements of the G7 governments, brought into that discussion the IMF, the World Bank, the EBRD, with the objective over time of seeking to provide thinking, ideas, input into the roadmap for economic reform. This is not a new process. It is not something that Iraq and the G7 are unfamiliar with, but it has not been a part of the process for the last a number of years. We could talk more about how this kind of strategy gets implemented. But one can see, for example, the impact, I think, of this kind of I'm going to call it consultation, commentary, in respect to the recent dinar evaluation that the government of Iraq took last month. where the IMF came in. This is outside of any arrangement or outside of any financial support, and welcomed that move as necessary to address various aspects of the government economic and budgetary crisis in Iraq. I think that action was a positive action, and it illustrates the interplay between government action and the response and input of the international financial community. Now, maybe we see further deterioration in the dinar as 2021 moves forward. But I think that kind of interplay is the kind of process that does have a supportive effect. I would mention lastly, I think the international community and hopefully Iraq, I believe the current government is receptive to the notion I'm going to mention, which is openness to supporting arrangements with the international financial community. And I'm referencing in particular the IMF. This is a step that would have to come from within Iraqi politics. There would have to be consensus around it. And I would say Iraq has had a mixed history, a mixed experience with respect to the four IMF arrangements that have been in place since 2004, 2005, onto the present. But those kinds of arrangements do have, I think, a very significant agenda setting component and a kind of political discipline on the process that may be supportive, I think can be supportive of a serious economic reform agenda within Iraq. So let me stop there, and hopefully that throws out some ideas for subsequent comment and question.
Thank you. Thank you, Olin. Those are very, very challenging ideas. And I think they're actually quite complementary to Ahmed's paper. Just mentioning once again for our audience, if you haven't already read Ahmed's paper, it's not very long, but it's very tightly worded. And I found myself reading it twice, and the third time even. And I read it slowly because it takes a while for some of these things to all come together. It's highly sophisticated kind of reasoning, but it's very, I think it's complemented by some of the big themes that Olin has just mentioned in terms of international cooperation with Iraq. But at this point, let's go on to Alia Mubayed for her comments, any comments she may have on the paper, plus her general views on the overall subject. Alia, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Mack, and thank you again for the Atlantic Council and Abbas to invite me to participate in yet another discussion about Iraq's critical economic challenges and reform agenda. I think what I would like I've read with great interest Ahmed's paper, and I read a lot of what he's been writing on Iraq. And if I may, I would like to structure my comments around three ideas. The first one really relates to the overall context for public finances in Iraq. And I think as much as the paper stresses that, I think I would like to be a little bit more alarming myself in terms of saying out loud that clearly Iraq's public finances are on a very dangerous and unsustainable path. And I think this we can see not only in basically the scale of the wider deficits that we have been seeing since 2018, which is a reference here that Ahmed has taken for his paper, and maybe this is a oil shock post-ISIS period. Deficits have grown to double digit, 15, 16, probably 20%, 2020. We're waiting for the final number, and are likely to remain in the context of 13, 15% in 2021. But I think what is important is to see that these larger deficits are really about much lower revenues to GDP. So we're going down from 35, 33% to 30% of GDP this year. But also against a rapidly increasing, basically, level of spending as a percentage of GDP, from around 34 to more than 53% of GDP of public spending this year. So the dynamics of the deterioration is really more important, and what belies that is much more important than the headlines number. Obviously, this has translated also in a in a potentially unsustainable path of public debt in Iraq. True, a lot of the people, and including Iraqis I talk to, they say, oh, but yes, you know, Iraq's public debt is still around 70 to 80% of GDP. Yes, true, but let's remind ourselves that public debt was only around 50 to 55% a couple of years ago. And it's really the delta and the pace of increase in public debt that we should be looking at, and that is really sort of the red flags we should try and address. And as we talk about the sustainable, increasingly unsustainable path, it's important to highlight that, unlike other countries in the region, Iraq is one of the only countries where the dependence on oil revenues has actually increased over the last a few years and decades, as opposed to seeing a decline in other countries. More importantly, the share of non-oil revenues has been declining quite dramatically at a time where, on average, across oil exporting countries, the oil shock has been really a catalyst for a lot of reform in the non-oil revenue side. But I think what is important is for us to understand that part of this unsustainability goes because of the repetitive, and that's what Ahmed says in his paper, the repetitively failed attempts at reform on the expenditure and the revenue side. And this failure to enact and implement, as Alan just said, fiscal reform is a key element that goes back, obviously, to the political economy of reform in Iraq and the system of the muhasaza, and particularly this entrenched practices that have become increasingly consolidated in the political bargaining about the allocation of resources throughout the budgetary process. And these have been key drivers of the unsustainability of public finance. Add to that, obviously, that the context, the demographic and social context of Iraq will increasingly keep the pressure on public finance. The demographics, the entry into the labor force of young Iraqis, the requirements for infrastructure and increased spending, but also improved efficiency of spending in an envelope that is increasingly shrinking of resources, puts a lot the onus on improving the efficiency as an essential part of improving the sustainability of public finances. And that takes me to my second point, which is really about the weakness of fiscal institutions that Ahmed is trying to address in his paper. The weakness of the public financial management system in Iraq, as Ahmed is pointing out, dates back to 2003. And again, despite the major reform programs that are listed in the paper, and including more recently the Public Financial Management Reform Support Facility from the World Bank, we have seen very little progress on the improvement of fiscal institutions on Iraq, whether it is on the planning process, whether it is on allocation of resources, budget transparency. And here, really what happened since October with the white paper is the first and very encouraging step in the right direction by putting the overall policy planning process in place through the white paper. But I guess this is the first essential but certainly insufficient, necessary but insufficient element of the reform that that we need to support, but also see develop further by building the capacity to carry forward and implement those reforms. And I think I will end on the third point by saying that Iraq has a lot to learn, and maybe Ahmed could potentially sort of expand a little bit on that from its regional and neighbors first, the oil exporting countries in the region, but also more broadly, oil exporting countries in general, particularly after the oil shock, where reforming fiscal institution and public financial management, payroll management systems, public investment management systems were at the heart of the economic reform agenda for enhancing the effectiveness of dwindling resources. And I think if I look at countries whether large economies like where demographic count like Saudi Arabia, or smaller economies that are also oil exporting, be it the UAE, Oman, even though, I mean, we cannot draw exact comparisons. But when I look at the agenda for fiscal reform, Iraq has been a major laggard, whether, as I mentioned, on the non-oil revenue side, on the public payroll and wage bill containment. Iraq could benefit a lot from the experience of its neighbor in terms of early retirement schemes, new central payroll systems being put in place, undertaking thorough salary reviews both at the central and at the SOE level, hiring freezes in order to contain the wage bill. Obviously, these are important, maybe unpopular reforms that need to be taken, but we have seen the benefits of these reforms happening in nearby countries, and I think Iraq has a lot to learn. The same applies for subsidy reform, for debt management reform, particularly in a country where financing needs are even much larger than what we see in smaller oil exporting countries in MENA. So I think, and that ties in with what Olin has said, that as much as the international engagement can be with Western countries, but I think having also peer-to-peer learning from the region would be very beneficial in Iraq, particularly at a time where we are seeing very serious economic cooperation engagements and agreements happening with Saudi Arabia and other GCC countries. And I think here institutions such as the World Bank and the IMF, but also the sort of economic, regional, and international groups for support, like the London Group, the Paris meeting that happened for Iraq, can be a conduit for this peer-to-peer exchanges that Iraq could benefit from and build its capacity to further the reforms that have been put forward within the white paper. Thank you.
Wow, we've got some really great ideas out there, and to deal with all these really very profound ideas that have been laid out by both Olin and Alia, I'd like first of all to give Ahmed a chance to respond to any specific points that deal with his paper, what he has on his mind. And while you're at it, Ahmed, I want you to be aware of a comment that we've already received from Ambassador Faisal Estrabadi. Faisal makes the point that the title of your newspaper says "Gone with the Muhassasa." And he says that as far as he can see, the Muhassasa is alive and well. So I'm going to ask you, first of all, if you wouldn't, let's say you had an opportunity to meet with Secretary of State designate Anthony Blinken or another member of the transition team, and they said, you know, this paper has come to our attention, but what do you mean by muhassasa? What does this mean in the Iraqi context? And how does it relate to the problems that Iraq has faced. Um, how, you're talking now to a non-Arabist on the Biden transition team. How would you answer this question, and how would you deal with Faisal's point that the Muhassasa seems to be alive and well, so far as he can tell?
Well, first of all, thank you very much. I appreciate the comments, and I think Ambassador Strabadi is absolutely correct. But what I meant by gone with Muhassasa is that the financial control has gone with the Muhassasa. So in a sense that maybe I should get better at English, I think. I think I've been speaking English for like 20 years, but there's still a lot I need to learn. But my whole idea was that it's gone. I mean, the financial control has gone with the Muhassasa. Not that Muhassasa is gone, but the Muhassasa brought the end of financial control. So maybe I need to rephrase that title in a way. But it seems to me like a nice way on Gone with the Wind, but I'm not sure I got the idea or the analogy perfectly right. So I'll correct that. Now, in terms of what is the Muhassasa, and without going too much details, the whole idea of the Muhassasa is basically to involve every political group, in the case of Iraq, ethno-sectarian group, in the formation of government, to give them the incentives to participate in the system as opposed to go out in all-out conflict. That's the whole idea behind it. The interesting thing in application for Iraq is that these kind of solutions, and by the way, it's another English shortcoming I have, it's a phrase I can always write but never say, and I think it's concitation, the idea of inviting all different parties. These normally are proposed as solutions to conflicts that are raging within a country in order to bring all different participants. In the case of Iraq, that happened before conflict. So we do things a bit differently in Iraq. But the problem with it is that because it involves every single party that is represented in parliament, that they share state resources according to their seats. The issue with that is that you don't have a government, one, with a majority in parliament, because the parliament is the government, but also then you get the opposition becomes individual opposition, i.e. members of parliament versus the government per se. And secondly, you don't get a coherent government process. There is no coherent program, because every party is pretty much running the show, running its ministry or unit according to itself. So when we don't function, i.e. when the general big picture comes in and Iraq needs to do this, well, Iraq can't do it. And even the phrase of the Iraqi government has no sense, because every ministry is its own. And that's really where we don't go far. We need to have, whatever it is, I mean, our parliamentary system in essence is got a lot of right elements, in the sense that you have, I mean, the idea behind is that you have one government, whether it is one party or a coalition of parties that have a majority in parliament that can pass a program that all the participants in the coalition agree on. And then you have an opposition that we don't have that. So we end up by a continuous cycle of repeating the same thing year after year without going anywhere. And that's, I think, Lebanon has been a prime example of that. But, you know, we do a very good job of going nowhere in that. Every year, the whole fight in every election cycle is over which control does each party have. So the more seats you have, the more you have in the system, and then you run the show on your own. So there is no continuity in a program, but also there is no government program per se. And also, as a result of it, I mean, it's a separate paper, by the way, is also a result of it is ministries that work at cross purposes to each other. In our case, one of the most disastrous one has been electricity. All the work done in spending money in 2013, 2014, 2012, 2013 onwards on all the power generators, there was a complete dysfunction between the ministry of this complete, no organization, actually, I'm looking for the word, between the Ministry of Oil and the Ministry of Electricity. The end results, we've bought billions of dollars worth of generators, but we don't have the fuel for them. So that's one aspect of that. And the other aspect is going nowhere. I think I'll answer two things without going too much into time and leaving other questions, is going over first of what Owen said. Basically, yes, Iraq definitely needs to work with the international community. But unlike the past, we don't really need so much as in financial aid. Yes, we do need financial aid, but we don't need it before we need help in sorting our own affairs, i.e. fixing our own problems and focusing on the real problem that we have and not at the side issues. In Iraq, we tend to have all our debate on side issues and we leave aside the biggest issue. Now, I think what Ali has said, which is very important in the sense that, yes, the piece started looking at the 2019 as my reference year, but also it followed through into this year as well, in the sense that the same inefficiency, the same paper-based system, the same shortage in the paper system feature right now. So for example, I think Ali knows that very well, the figures, but those who don't know the figures, our current budget, as yes, the expenditures have ballooned. And yes, one of the problems of the paper-based system is that we don't really know how exactly these have ballooned. I mean, we look at salaries and pensions and stuff, and the first paper has something like 100 pages that I spent my Christmas going over. But the essence is that we end up by having a projected overall deficit of 71 trillion dinars, okay, which is like enormous. But yet, it says that, the same budget process says that, what, out of that 71, there's something like 23 trillion dinars, which is already pre-funded one way or the other through restructuring debt and what have you. That sounds good. So really, the real deficit is 47 trillion dinars. And as a result of that, we're expecting the CBI to indirectly do the monetization of up to 45 trillion of that. Now, the same table, by the way, which has that, if you look deep into it, you find inconsistencies whereby the budget, the funding that's supposed to cover the 45 is in fact 71. And you go and think, well, this is the most important thing, because if the CBI is supporting the government indirectly, and yet it doesn't have to cover the whole deficit itself, why is it written like that? And it's, again, because it is a paper-based system.
Okay, let me jump in here, if I may, and note that we've had a couple of questions from people who have no little experience dealing with Iraq. John de Blasio is one, and he mentions the efforts that were made by USAID to try to work on some of these financial systems problems, and that they failed, as he sees it, primarily because those who wanted transparency were continually overridden by the corrupt purposes of other parties in the Iraqi political system. And he said, wouldn't another program fail if the corruption problem isn't solved first? And then I have a comment from Andrew Snow, worked from the State Department side on Iraq economic issues for several years. And he's very appreciative of the paper's focus on financial systems. And he wonders why it's so difficult to reform this. And he gets to some of the things that Olin mentioned about roles for the IMF and World Bank and the US Treasury, and how they had tried to work with Iraqi authorities to make these reforms move forward, but were never able to make such progress. And I would only note in that regard that one big change is that now we have the white paper of Ali Alawi, the deputy prime minister, that's out there as kind of a roadmap, in a way, for the Iraqi government. And, this gets me back to Olin's point that there's got to be a role for the Western governments, for international financial institutions to support the Iraqi government. The kind of synergy that Olin was talking about could perhaps focus on this question of budgeting, or at least it seems possible to me. But let me ask you, Olin, if you had a chance, and I suspect you probably will, to talk to some of the people on the Biden transition team, maybe you already have. How would you go about, or would you have a suggestion to them as to how the United States might try to mobilize like-minded governments and international financial institutions to provide some kind of support in the realm of technical advice and ideas for what the Iraqi government is trying to do? Could this be done in the short term without the problem of having to provide considerable additional funding to the Iraqi government at this near point in a new U.S. administration?
Well, you pose a tough question, David. I think funding is a secondary issue. Ahmed also had made that point. I think what is called for is an effort. There has to be commitment and receptivity on both sides. And that's why I'm attracted to the current moment, because I think on the Iraqi side, the leadership that is now in the government, I'm not referring to the parliament, sees benefit from relationship with the international financial community. We see this in the initiative that was taken with respect to the Iraq Economic Contact Group. That kind of process, and they envision that as a 3-year process. But I think that process can be elevated. It can be expanded by way of its participants to perhaps, for example, include participants from the Iraq parliament. It can be regularized. It could become a more robust process and more directly linked to the G7 process. I take Alia's point, a very important point, I think, and I overlooked this in my initial comments, that there is learning to be had from the region itself. And that needs to be incorporated in this kind of structured consultation. But the G7, because it can be the motivator that unlocks expertise, that unlocks financing potentially outside of national budgets. That expertise and potential financing comes from institutions, IMF, World Bank, EBRD, others. But the G7 and also an extended G7 process as well, if greater political priority was given to the role of the G7, and that's an informal but terribly important process, potentially, can make a difference in building the kind of support system, the framing of agenda, discipline on the political process that I think is needed. One can see, for example, a recent illustration. The G7 process, when Japan chaired it back in 2016, led to the last IMF standby arrangement, which included policy components as well. I would say that arrangement was not the most successful example. Part of it was the political context within Iraq. This was ISIS linked, I think, in its motivation. Only about half of those funds were distributed. But it illustrates, and going back to the first IMF program back in 2005, and there was a transitional IMF arrangement also prior to that in connection with the a large debt rescheduling in 2004. The G7 played an instrumental, a motivating role in both of those situations. And it has the potential, if there's the political commitment at the top, and this is where outside governments, I think, need to recognize that there is a moment here that perhaps can create a new momentum over time for reform to enlarge the engagement that can be supportive. But there has to be that political commitment on both sides. Absent that, it's of little utility. But where that political commitment exists, and there was a kind of unity, for example, if one goes back to 2004 and the effort internationally that was made to restructure Iraq's enormous debt, it was a product of that kind of political unity. Now, that is almost impossible, I would say, very, very difficult, certainly, to recreate in the current setting. But there is a lot of space between that kind of political flexibility and room to run and where we are today. There is room to elevate, to prioritize, to extend the dialogue, and to try to be creative in ways that interface in a meaningful fashion with the political elites, I think, in Iraq. A very challenging situation, but it's worth, I think, the effort.
Well, thank you, Olin, for giving us those ideas about your concepts for an international framework that would be supportive of Iraq in a practical way. And you've nicely pulled in Alia's points about regional governments, particularly Saudi Arabia and other GCC governments, and how they can contribute along with the Western governments and the international financial institutions. We're pretty close to the end of the hour. I'm going to take Olin's comments as his final summing up. Then I'll ask Alia to make a few comments. And Alia, if you would you also focus on one question from Mustafa? What is the way forward for Iraq to balance its massive public employees' payroll while avoiding public outrage? A very specific question, and I think you could probably provide us with a good answer on that. And then we'll give the last word to Ahmed. But let's go ahead with Alia at this point and her any final comments she wants to make.
On this specific question, I mean, obviously, the response to Iraq's wage bill problem is not only a fiscal approach. It's not about only rationalizing the wage bill by the type of reforms that I talked about, whether payroll management, early retirement, etc. I think the most important reform is about getting growth to be job creating in Iraq. And not only for the new entrants into the labor market, but to the kind of churning that you need to do, and the transition from those that go from the public side to the private side. Particularly that Iraq does not have the same problem that we see in other GCC countries, where you have a wide, basically, wedge between the wages of the public sector and the wages of the private sector. The problem in Iraq is the quantity of private sector jobs that we need to expand and provide quality jobs so that people don't always think of the public sector as the best employer. So that's one point. The second issue that you can do is obviously in general raise awareness, and this is more my final comment to complement what Olin said. As much as engagement with the international community is important, but I think what Iraq and Iraq policymakers need is to engage with the citizens with public opinions about the importance of these reforms that is directly impacting them and will continue to impact them. And to highlight the policy trade-offs that exist and the recent currency devaluation. And by answering another question, no, I don't think it's enough. If there is no more fiscal reform and more structural reforms, Iraq will need to devalue more. But this is the kind of trade-off that policymakers need to explain to the population and not only to the parliamentarians in order to create the necessary public debate and buy-in from as wide as possible spectrum of economic private agents.
Okay, thank you, Alia. Well, I'm going to say that we've already had our concluding remarks from both Olin and Alia. I'm going to give Ahmed a last chance here before we lose our tolerance from the Zoom platform, and would simply apologize to the many questioners that we haven't been able to specifically answer today. I think the Atlantic Council staff can provide to the panelists specific questions from specific individuals, and perhaps they'll be able to answer them offline. Ahmed, you have the floor for some final remarks.
Thank you very much for that. Thank you all, by the way, for the comments, and thanks for the audience for taking part and listening to this. Yes, on my part, I'll be very happy to answer any question that wasn't answered directly. Contact me either on my Twitter or through the Atlantic Council. I'm more than happy to answer these. Now, to conclude in a way, basically, our biggest problem has been our dependence on oil. And basically, we've been bailed out every time and every crisis. We've been bailed out by recovering oil prices, which what it does, it creates a culture inside the country in which by all we need is to hold on, to soldier on through the crisis, and then we'll get through it. The problem with it, obviously, that's unsustainable. It's getting worse, but that's the way the mentality is, and that perpetuates all the corruption, perpetuates all the wrong practices, and that's why we have reforms of IFMIS, or reforms done by US aid in 2003. And if you read the report in 2003, 2006, 2009, 2016, they're all the same. They all start with good intentions and brilliant programs, and they go nowhere, because there is no real intention on the Iraqi side really to reform, because the incentives politically are not there, and system-wide they're not there, because they know that just hold on around the corner, oil prices would recover and we'll be back to normal. The important thing, I think, this time around is, one, the crisis is very different than anything we've seen before. The changes in the oil market are real and significant. And yes, we can learn a lot from our neighbors, what they've done in 2014. There's a lot to learn. But crucially, I think the most important thing is the current white paper, pretty much chaired and created by Minister Alawi, has been, for the first time, you get an Iraqi government that acknowledges the root cause of a problem and not the symptoms. Every prior one, we seek to reform the systems and we don't look at the core. Now that comes up to the last piece, which is basically international support. Yes, Iraq does need international support, but absolutely correct when you said that we needed more on the technical side. Funding can be secondary, but what we need to do different than the past is we cannot do the support from remote. In the sense, a lot of the failures have been in the sense that you rely on agents of the same government, the same inept institutions to carry out the reforms, and i.e. mostly through comfort call. What we need is an understanding of what Iraq is, understanding where the problem is, because we cannot execute 20 things at the same time. We're barely lucky if we can execute 5 to 10. That's enough to start the ball rolling. But we need it more, and we need technical, and we need more discussions like this. And in that, I'll end, and I'll say thank you to all. And once again, I'm more than happy to answer any other questions.
Well, thank you to all three panelists. Thank you for the Atlantic Council staff in organizing this. And I'm particularly pleased that we ended on the note of a reference to Ali Alawi and the white paper, since that was something that was first unveiled in discussions that were being held by Dr. Abbas and his Iraq team at the Atlantic Council with counterparts in Europe before Ali Alawi entered the government. So I do think it's a point on which the international community can provide support for Iraq going forward. And with that, thank you, everyone. Have a good day.
Thank you all.